Hi, it's Ms. Blanchard here with our first lecture on Chapter 20. I'm going to try and keep it quick, but we're starting with the Commonwealth and Empire, and today we're focusing on the Commonwealth. A quick AP review question, of course, is from the old test, but you could still see on the SAT too. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward was written in the 1880s. Was a utopian reaction to which of the following? So this was the vignette in your textbook for Chapter 20. It's a good thing to take a look at. And we talked about that Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is the #1 selling book of the 19th century, behind the Bible, of course. Looking Backwards is actually the #2 best-selling book after Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's really important because it highlights the disillusionment with the increasingly competitive and industrial society that is happening at the time period. So we're going to look at a national governing class with a quick review of what's going on in the cities. So you have to ask yourself, how do the problems in government, the patronage, the coinage, the cronyism, the political machines, as well as the problems with the economy, such as the Depression of 1893 and the ongoing Long Depression from the Panic of 1897, as well as issues with agriculture and the emerging populist movement, impact the politics of the Gilded Age. A quick review. At the city level, you have going on a lot of graft, that honest graft we talked about in class, as well as the political machines, best exemplified by Tammany Hall and the Tweed Ring under Boss Tweed. We looked at the pictures by Thomas Nast in class, and we watched the documentary, The Tweed Courthouse, the courthouse that cost $13 million at the time. Today, anywhere from $130 to $250 million in costs because of all the kickbacks to Tweed and his ring. The building of the Brooklyn Bridge, built by immigrants, and much less corruption going on, but all of those, that cronyism and the patronage that the Tweed Ring gives out and Tammany Hall gives out to ensure supporters in the immigrant classes. But you also have the bosses of the Senate, the large corporations that seem to buy up senators, and a lot of the senators turned a blind eye to things like Tammany Hall that keep some of them in power, as well as the corporate greed. So we're going to skip through a lot of these because we've talked about them so much in class. Remember, though, that Tammany Hall is both good and bad. Although there is a lot of corruption, there's also a lot of welfare brought by Tammany Hall. Food, coal, legal services, even naturalization services for loyal supporters and incoming immigrants help provide a lot of social services that the federal government just didn't provide back then. However, it does erupt into one of the worst scandals in American history. So I want to concentrate on national politics, especially with our 7 presidents here from the end of Reconstruction until the turn of the century: Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, and McKinley. There's 5 presidential elections between the end of Reconstruction, Hayes's election in 1876, and the ensuing Second Corrupt Bargain in 1877, until 1892 are some of the most closely contested elections ever. No more than 1% of the popular vote separates the candidates in 3 out of these 5 elections. But Congress is split as well. Democrats are going to control the House. They have the numerical superiority in the northern urban cities as well as the southerners. And the Republicans are going to hold the Senate because they simply hold more states in the more urbanized north. And the stalemate makes it difficult for any of the presidents or Congress to pass much significant legislation. And there's really only 4 or 5 great acts that we talk about after those great Civil War acts we already discussed. The one, and we'll talk about it shortly, is the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 that attempts to reform a lot of these civil service violations. We've already talked about the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act in class. And one thing we don't spend a lot of time on is the McKinley Tariff. It's really just another tariff. Since the Morrill Tariff during the Civil War, the tariff is slowly increasing over the time period. And the McKinley Tariff is really the reason that Cleveland, McKinley, Cleveland go as they do. Cleveland loses on the issue of the trust. And while Harrison is in office in 1890, he passes this McKinley Tariff, raising the tariff higher and higher, which results in a lot of economic destabilization, and Cleveland then returns in the election of 1892. So watch this two-party stalemate that's going on during the Gilded Age. And what I really want you to watch is the division between the electoral votes and the popular votes, not so much the states themselves. And you see in 1876 that second corrupt bargain and the resulting compromise of 1877, an almost even split. And it's going to be exacerbated. You see the Electoral College votes switching, but the popular vote in 1880, no candidate actually receives a majority of the vote. Again in 1884, no party wins 50% of the popular vote. And then here's 1888 with, again, no party receiving the popular vote. And then the election of 1892 with the populist candidate, which that third party candidate preventing any one party from getting a majority of the vote. And just like Ohio is a swing state today, you're going to have swing states back there of New York, Indiana, and still Ohio. These three states swung the 5 presidential elections where Republicans and Democrats are so closely divided. And the result is that 16 of the 20 presidential and vice presidential candidates are from those swing states, New York, Ohio, and Indiana. So you have two big voting blocks during the time period. The Democrats, supported by white Southerners, farmers, immigrants, and the poor. The white Southerners still blaming the Northern Republicans for the Civil War, largely farmers, and immigrants really supporting things like Tammany Hall, as well as the working poor in large cities in the industrial North. It's favored by the white supremacists and supported labor unions, and it's weakened, though, by its opposition to the Civil War. This seems very different and backwards from today's political system. So please remember that these are the old political parties that are going to last until really the election of, well, the late 1930s and really the election of 1948. The Northern Republican bloc is going to be supported by, of course, Northerners, but also African Americans who felt that the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln had helped free them in the Civil War, as well as nativists, these old know-nothings, the American Party that don't like the immigrants that are being given favors by Tammany Hall. They also supported big business and favored anti-immigration laws. And if you look at these years, you have some of the highest voting turnout rates in history. In 1876, over 80%, and in the other years, well into the 70%. This is going to be eroded away in the 20th century to where we really don't see numbers anywhere like this anymore. So if we look at this map one more time, really just keep your eyes here on the South. You see South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida in 1876 were the 3 states that in which Reconstruction had not ended yet, so still has African Americans voting. But after this, you see them staying solidly blue throughout the time period. So this is going to become a phenomenon known as the Solid South, that they're a solid bloc voting all together, and they're solidly Democratic until well until the 1950s. All over the issue of Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans supposedly causing the Civil War, and the measures of radical Reconstruction. So the government during this time period, although it's supposedly a laissez-faire government, is growing in size and scope with new employees, agencies like the ICC, and responsibilities such as trust vesting, changing the character of the government. Taxes increased as local governments assumed responsibility for providing vital services at the local level like police, fire protection, water, schools, and parks, a lot of which are the result of the City Beautiful movement ushered in by people like Frederick Law Olmsted. But one of the most important issues in the time period was civil service reform. The federal bureaucracy had swelled in size after the Civil War, and these positions are still appointed with a spoil system. The Department of Agriculture, the Bureau, and Indian Affairs are added as well as we move into the West and can have this ongoing Indian problem we've discussed. And the Treasury Department grows from 4,000 employees to 25,000 as you have things like the tariff becoming a mainstay of the American economy. Congressmen often took bribes or company stocks for their votes, and in fact that's partially some of the underlying causes of the scandals during Grant's administration. And then of course the political machines are ruling the cities through bribes and personal favors. And what really is a tipping point here for reform is when Charles Guiteau, who's seeking the appointment by President Garfield for a civil service position, shoots him. We saw this also echoed in The Devil in the White City, where the mayor of Chicago is shot by a man seeking a federal appointmentship. So this is certainly a theme we see at both the national level and as well as in Chicago. So because of Garfield's assassination, the civil service reform is pushed through in the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. There creates a merit-based exam for the civil service jobs. The idea that if the spoils system could kill a president, it was time to end the spoils system. State and local governments mirror these reforms in the 1880s and the 1890s, and its aim is to create a more professional bureaucracy based on meritocracy. The Pendleton Civil Service Act is also going to create a system of standards that are developed for certain federal jobs, pre-qualifications. This is where things like you actually have to have a law degree to become a lawyer or a judge. And there's similar efforts paralleled in other professional fields, and your book mentions like the American Medical Association and the American History Association. The legislative branch is also given a more active role under the Circuit Court of Appeals Act of 1891. And this is going to mirror and kind of foreshadow some of the efforts by the progressives to bring scientific efficiency, qualifications, and that scientific method of pragmatism to the workplace and to the government. And it's part of an early set of reforms, part of the good government movement, sometimes called the GOO movement, for the G-O in good and the G-O in government, that's going to be ushered in by other progressive muckrakers like Lincoln Steffens. In the time period, 28 new state commissions are also created to regulate industries, especially the railroads. In a court case of Munn v. Illinois, in which the early Granger movement, a movement of farmers, was popular, Illinois declared railroads to be public highways and insisted that they could regulate the rates on them. This is going to be overturned 10 years later by the Wabash case in Wabash versus Illinois, saying that only Congress can regulate interstate trade. Although this seems to also have been hinted at the court case we looked at last year in Gibbons v. Ogden. But there is still an obvious need to regulate trade, especially the railroads and railroad rates. That's going to lead to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Act, which sets up the Interstate Commerce Commission to more closely regulate especially railroads. The ICC is going to regulate the railroad industry, especially freight rates, and this is the first attempt by the federal government to really try and regulate big business. And it essentially becomes the model for future regulatory agencies. The Sherman Antitrust Act is also passed in 1890, which makes it illegal to restrain trade, which is punishable by the dissolution of the company. But this is largely going to be made ineffective by a court case just a few years later called the E.C. Knight case. It's the first test of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it weakens it, ruling that sugar monopolies do not restrain trade because there's a difference between making a product and selling a product. So basically saying that sugar refineries can still monopolize the industry. It's going to be further weakened in subsequent court rulings that applies it against labor unions instead of businesses, and is actually going to help business proliferate at the expense of labor unions. The first successful enactment of it won't be until Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in the Northern Securities case, and we'll address that again later. So in the views of a lot of Americans, especially farmers in the West, government seems to be practicing a laissez-faire system at the expense of farmers that's led to this kind of rodeo of industry, although we see a few but significant attempts for the government to intervene. Okay, I'm going to leave it off there, where next time we'll continue working on farmers and workers.